Imagine burying the only person who ever made you human. Not the most powerful person you knew. Not the most beautiful. The one who made you human. The one who looked at a man the rest of the world feared and somehow saw something worth staying for. The one who laughed at your silence instead of trembling at it. The one who placed your hand on her stomach one quiet evening and whispered, "He has your stubbornness already. I can feel it." Now imagine lowering that person into the ground. The night Alessandro Moretti buried his wife, the rain fell like it had a debt to settle. It came down in sheets across the iron gates of Moretti Manor, turned the gravel paths to rivers, soaked through the black coats of the men standing in formation behind their boss. Not one of them spoke, not one of them moved. Because Alessandro had gone somewhere, none of them could follow. Somewhere behind his eyes, past the grief, into a silence so complete it frightened men who had never been frightened of anything. He had been the most feared mafia boss in Italy since the age of 31. He had built an empire on the kind of reputation that made rooms go quiet when his name was spoken. Rivals negotiated with him not because they respected him, but because the alternative was a lesson no one wanted to learn twice. He had never begged, never hesitated, never once let a single human being see the place inside him where something soft still lived. Isabella had found it anyway. She always did. And now the mahogany coffin was descending into the cold Sicilian earth, and Alessandro Moretti, the man the underworld called Il Fantasma, the ghost, stepped forward and pressed his palm flat against the wood. Just once. The way you touch something, you know, you will never touch again. He did not cry. The rain cried for him. What broke him, what would continue to break him for 12 years of sleepless nights, was not just the loss of the woman inside that coffin. It was the other truth. The truth that lived beneath it. Isabella had been 4 months pregnant when the car went off that coastal road. There had been no survivors. The coroner had confirmed it with the kind of professional gentleness that Alessandro found unbearable. He hadn't just buried a wife. He had buried a child he never held, a child who never took a breath, a child who never once heard his voice or knew his name. He placed a single white rose on the coffin before they covered it. Then he walked back through the iron gates. And the Alessandro Moretti, who had loved Isabella, was buried in that grave, along with her. For 12 years, Alessandro Moretti grieved a woman who was still breathing. Grief, in most men, eventually softens. It rounds at the edges. It learns to share space with ordinary life, with meals and mornings and the small distractions that pull the living away from the dead. Most men, given enough time, find their way back to something resembling themselves. Alessandro Moretti was not most men. He did not soften. He calcified. He turned grief into architecture, built it into the walls of everything he touched, every decision he made, every man who served beneath him. The Moretti Empire, already vast when Isabella died, doubled in reach within 3 years of her death, then doubled again. Alessandro worked with the focused relentlessness of a man who had nothing else. No warmth to protect, no softness left to guard. Only the empire, expanding outward like a wound that couldn't close. The fear surrounding his name grew proportional to his silence. Men who had negotiated with him before Isabella's death said afterward that something had left his eyes. Not his intelligence, not his precision, something else. The thing that had made him, underneath all of it, recognizable as a person. It was gone, and in its place was a stillness that the men closest to him found deeply unsettling. Because stillness in Alessandro never meant peace. It meant calculation. It meant something was already decided that you didn't know about yet. He never remarried. This was a matter of significant concern to his advisors and a source of quiet fascination to the families they did business with. Alliance after alliance was proposed. Women of wealth and lineage were presented, always carefully, always through intermediaries who understood that the approach required delicacy. Alessandro declined everyone, never with anger, never with explanation, simply with a silence that closed the subject permanently. He was not cruel about it. He simply made it understood that the conversation was one he would not be having. Once a year, on the anniversary of Isabella's death, he visited the grave alone. No guards, no lieutenants, no ceremony. He drove himself, something he never otherwise did, in a black car with no plates, to the private cemetery on the eastern edge of the Moretti estate. He stayed for exactly 20 minutes. He brought white roses, always white, always 7, a number only he understood the significance of. And every year, before he left, he stood before the headstone and read the inscription with the same expression a man wears when he's confirming a wound is still there. Isabella Moretti, beloved wife and mother. The word beloved he could survive. The word mother undid him every time, because it memorialized something that had never been allowed to exist. A mother without children. A title carved in stone for a role that a car and a coastal road and 4 months of pregnancy had made impossible. He never stayed longer than 20 minutes. He never trusted himself to. The one exception to Alessandro's absolute isolation was a man named Dante Ricci. Dante had served the Moretti family for 16 years. He was compact and quiet, and possessed the kind of loyalty that expressed itself not in declarations, but in consistency, always present, never overclaiming his importance, reading Alessandro's silences with an accuracy that no one else had ever managed. After Isabella died, when Alessandro pushed everyone else to a careful distance, Dante simply remained. He didn't try to fill the silence. He just occupied the same room with it, which was the only thing Alessandro could tolerate. Alessandro trusted him completely. This was, in the world Alessandro moved through, the most dangerous thing a man could do. But he didn't know that yet. On the eve of his 45th birthday, Alessandro sat in the dark of Isabella's old room, unchanged, untouched, preserved with the specific cruelty of a man who couldn't let go, and held the photograph he had carried for 12 years. Isabella at the coast, summer, laughing at something just past the camera's edge. 4 months before everything ended. He sat with it until the room went fully dark, and the manor settled into silence around him. He had no idea that somewhere across Italy, the woman in that photograph was preparing to walk back into his life. The alarm sounded at 11:47 p.m. Not the perimeter sensors that tripped occasionally when deer moved through the tree line. Not the motion detectors along the eastern wall that the wind could fool on bad nights. The front gate alarm. The one that had never once been triggered by accident in 12 years, because nothing approached the front gate of Moretti Manor without being seen, stopped, and turned around long before it got close enough to matter. Every guard on the property moved within 30 seconds. Dante got the call first. He was in the operations room on the ground floor when his phone rang. One of the gate monitors, voice already strange, already trying to find words for something that didn't have them. Dante listened for 4 seconds. Then he went completely still. The color left his face in a single movement, like a curtain being pulled. The man beside him noticed and asked what was wrong. Dante didn't answer. He was already moving toward Alessandro's location. He found him in Isabella's room, sitting in the dark, the way he did every year on this night, the photograph still in his hand. Dante stood in the doorway and said only, "You need to come see the monitors." His voice was flat, in a way that Alessandro had learned, over 16 years, to pay attention to. Not alarmed, not urgent, evacuated, like something had emptied out of it. Alessandro followed him without asking why. The operations room had 4 monitors running gate feeds. Alessandro stepped in front of the central screen and looked. The image was grainy with rain. The floodlights at the gate caught the figure in fragments. A woman in a black coat, hood pushed back despite the downpour, standing perfectly still at the iron bars. Soaked through. Not knocking, not calling out, just standing, the way a person stands when they have already decided something and are simply waiting for the world to catch up. Alessandro studied the screen. Then he said, very quietly, "Remove her." The guard at the gate reached for the intercom, and the woman looked up, not toward the sound, not toward the guards, directly into the camera, with the precise, unhurried certainty of someone who knew exactly where it was, who had always known. Alessandro's hand came up slowly and stopped the guard's arm before he touched the intercom. The room went silent. He stood at that monitor for a long moment, long enough that the men around him exchanged glances. They were careful to keep brief. Then he set down the photograph he had carried from Isabella's room without realizing he still had it. He walked out of the operations room, through the corridor, out the front entrance of the manor, and down the gravel path toward the gate. Alone. No guards, no weapon drawn, against every protocol he had written himself and enforced, without exception, for 12 years. The rain hit him immediately. He didn't register it. She was still standing exactly where she'd been on the monitor, 6 feet inside the gate now, because someone had opened it without being told to, because some instructions don't require words. She was thinner than he remembered. There were 12 years in her face that hadn't been there before. But she stood the way she had always stood, like the ground beneath her was a decision she had already made. Alessandro stopped, 6 feet away. He did not speak. He did not reach for her. He stood in the rain and looked at the face he had pressed his lips to one final time against a mahogany coffin, and something in his chest did something he had no word for and no intention of showing. Then he looked down. 2 boys stood slightly behind her, side by side, watching him with the particular stillness of children who have been prepared for something difficult and have decided to be brave about it. Identical in every visible way. Dark hair, rain-flattened, straight spines, hands at their sides, and gray eyes, his gray eyes, exact in color and in the quality of their stillness, the kind of eyes that observed rather than reacted, that took inventory of a room before committing to an expression. Alessandro's gaze moved across their faces slowly, then stopped, because along the left jawline of each boy, faint but unmistakable in the floodlight, was the small crescent-shaped mark that every Moretti male had carried for 4 generations. His father had it, his grandfather before him. Alessandro had it himself, just below his left ear. The boys had it too. The one on the left, the one who stood a half step ahead, who had the bearing of someone who had appointed himself responsible for things, stepped forward. He looked up at Alessandro with those gray eyes and said, in a voice that was steady in the way that only children who have rehearsed something very hard can manage, "Are you our father?" The rain fell. Alessandro Moretti, the most feared man in Italy, stood in the dark and the downpour and said nothing at all. And somewhere beneath the silence, a question that would unravel 12 years of carefully constructed lies was already beginning to form. Why did she wait this long? They were brought inside. Alessandro gave the instruction with a single gesture, the kind that required no translation among his men, and said nothing further as Isabella and the 2 boys were led through the front entrance and into the main sitting room. He followed at a distance that was deliberate. He needed 4 seconds and 8 steps to arrange his face back into something that revealed nothing, and he used every one of them. The sitting room was lit low, the fire still going from earlier in the evening. Isabella stood near the center of it, water still running from the hem of her coat onto the stone floor, and looked around the room with the expression of a woman confronting a version of her own memory. The furniture had changed, the paintings had not. Her eyes moved across each one in a way that Alessandro noticed and filed. He looked at Dante. The boys. Dante understood. He crossed to the twins with the careful, non-threatening posture of a man who had experience managing situations that required gentleness, and spoke to them quietly. The one who had spoken at the gate, Luca, Alessandro would learn, watched Dante with the same gray-eyed assessment he had turned on Alessandro outside. The other one, Marco, was already looking at the bookshelves. They allowed themselves to be guided out of the room. The door closed. Alessandro turned to face his wife. The silence between them was not the silence of people with nothing to say. It was the silence of people with 12 years of things to say, and no map for where to begin. Isabella met his eyes and held them, and he saw in hers something he had not expected. Not guilt, not relief, not the overflow of a woman who had been carrying something too long and finally set it down. Quiet devastation. The expression of someone who understood exactly what this moment had cost, and had arrived anyway, because the alternative had finally become impossible. He spoke first. "You have 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't have you removed from this house and out of Italy by morning." His voice was level, room temperature, the voice he used when he was not angry, but had already passed through anger into something colder and more permanent. Isabella had heard it before. She knew what it meant. She didn't flinch. She said, "Before you say anything else, ask me who is in that grave." The room shifted, not physically, something in the air of it. Alessandro went very still, in the way that preceded his most dangerous moments, and Isabella held her ground in the way of a woman who had spent 12 years preparing for this exact silence and had decided she could survive it. He said nothing. She continued, "I need you to ask me, Alessandro, because everything that happened, everything I did, every year I stayed away, it all starts with the answer to that question, and I need you to hear it before you decide anything." A long moment passed. "Who?" he said finally, each word placed like something heavy being set on glass, "is in that grave." Something moved through Isabella's expression. Not relief, exactly. More like the particular release of a person who has held their breath across 12 years and is only now, in this room, allowing themselves to exhale. "Someone wanted us dead," she said. "Both of us." The pregnancy was the trigger. Someone inside this house decided that an heir to the Moretti line was a threat they couldn't allow to survive. They arranged everything, the accident, the identification, the burial. All of it was constructed. I was warned 3 weeks before it happened, and I was given a choice. She paused. "I didn't run because I was afraid of you. I ran because the person who warned me told me the order had already been given, and that if I surfaced, if I told you, if I gave any sign that I was alive, they would finish what they started. Not just with me." Her eyes moved briefly toward the door through which Luca and Marco had been taken. "With them." Alessandro crossed the room in 4 steps and stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she had to look up to hold his gaze. His voice dropped, not in volume, but in temperature. "Someone inside this house." It was not a question. It was a man pulling on a thread and beginning to feel the shape of what was attached to it. "I'm not going to tell you the name tonight. Isabella said quietly. Not yet. Not until I know who is still here and who is still trusted. Because the person who did this didn't do it alone, and I have been waiting 12 years to say this in the right room, in front of the right people. She held his gaze without breaking. I have proof. I have names. I have everything. But I need to know that when I give it to you, the right person is standing in this room to hear it. Alessandro looked at her for a long time, long enough to take her apart and put her back together with his eyes, long enough to test the architecture of what she was saying against 12 years of a story he had believed without question, because he had stood at that graveside and touched that coffin, and the grief had been real, which meant the loss had to have been real, which meant someone had constructed an elaborate lie and stood next to him while he buried it. He took one step back. Who? He said, and his voice was barely above a whisper now, which was somehow more frightening than volume. Is in that grave, Isabella. She looked at him, at the man she had watched from a distance for 12 years, the man who had visited that headstone with white roses every anniversary, the man who had raised an empire on the fuel of losing her. And her voice, when it came, was the quietest it had been all night. A woman who loved you enough to die in my place. She told it from the beginning. Not because Alessandro asked her to, because she had learned, in 12 years of silence, that the only way to make a person believe something that defies their entire understanding of reality is to build it from the foundation up, stone by stone. No shortcuts, no jumping to the name at the end before the structure beneath it is solid enough to hold the weight. Alessandro sat. He did not speak. He did not move. He gave her the particular quality of attention that had always distinguished him from other men. Total, unblinking, architectural. He was not just listening. He was constructing something internally, testing each piece as it arrived, pressing on the joints to find where they held and where they gave. Isabella spoke. 3 weeks before the accident, she told him, a woman came to her room after midnight, a servant named Sophia, a woman who had worked inside the manor for 6 years, quiet and careful and largely invisible in the way that good servants learn to be. Sophia had come, not with suspicion, but with certainty. She had overheard something she was not meant to hear. A conversation between 2 men, conducted in the East Corridor after the rest of the house had gone to sleep, about a problem that needed to be resolved before it became permanent. The problem was the pregnancy. Isabella watched Alessandro's face as she said this, and saw something move through it that he didn't catch in time to suppress. A compression around the eyes, a tightening at the jaw, the expression of a man recalibrating every assumption he has made about a chapter of his life he believed was closed. She continued. The child, if born, would consolidate the Moretti inheritance in a direction that closed off a particular set of possibilities. There were men, one man specifically, who had spent years positioning himself in Alessandro's shadow with a longer game in mind. A legitimate Moretti heir didn't just change the succession, it ended it. And so the decision had been made. Not to wait, not to negotiate, to remove the problem at the source. Sophia had nothing to gain from telling her. She was a servant. She had no power, no protection, no leverage. She came anyway, in the dark, because she had watched Isabella for 6 years and had decided that some things were not something a person could unknow and live with. Isabella had wanted to go to Alessandro immediately. Sophia stopped her. The order, Sophia had told her, has already been given. If you tell him, they will know you were warned, and they will finish it before he can stop them. You and the child. The only way both of you survive is if both of you disappear. What followed was organized with a precision that still unsettled Isabella to describe. Sophia knew a coroner, a man with debts of the kind that made him available for certain arrangements. False dental records were constructed from a woman already deceased, whose records could be substituted without detection. A car was sourced. A coastal road was selected. The fire was designed to make confirmation of identity a formality rather than an investigation. Sophia took Isabella's place in that car. She did it without hesitation, without asking for anything in return. She drove it off that road herself on a rainy Tuesday night and gave her life so that a woman she worked for and 2 children who hadn't yet been born could have theirs. Isabella disappeared to a small coastal village in Sicily. She took a false name. She rented a house at the edge of the water, far enough from anyone who might recognize her face, close enough to the sea that she could breathe. She raised Luca and Marco alone, telling them the truth in pieces, calibrated carefully to their age, building toward this night from the moment they were old enough to understand that the man in the photograph their mother kept was not a stranger. She watched the Moretti Empire from a distance. She watched Alessandro become what grief made him. She watched the anniversaries pass. She always knew when he visited the grave, because she had people she trusted in careful places, and because she needed to know he was still standing. She waited until the boys were old enough to make the return impossible to misunderstand. Then she said the name. It was Dante. Alessandro did not move. Dante Ricci, she said, in case the full name made it more real. He arranged the coroner. He sourced the car. He selected the road. Sophia named him specifically, not as a suspicion, as a certainty. She had heard his voice. The fire crackled once in the grate. Alessandro sat with the name, the way a man sits with a verdict, not processing it so much as absorbing it, letting it move through everything it needed to move through. Dante. The man who had stood at that graveside in the rain and wept with a conviction that Alessandro had never once questioned, because grief shared is the most intimate form of trust, and he had believed in it completely. Dante. Who had remained when everyone else kept their distance. Dante. Who had read his silences for 16 years with an accuracy that Alessandro had always taken for loyalty. Every moment between them was now a room Alessandro had to walk back through with a different light source. Every conversation, every quiet evening, every year that Dante had driven him to that grave and waited at a respectful distance while Alessandro knelt before a headstone with the wrong name on it. He sat with all of it. He did not speak. Isabella reached into her coat. From an interior pocket she withdrew an envelope, not a new one. The paper had gone the color of old ivory, softened at the corners from years of handling, the edges worn with the particular tenderness of something that has been opened and resealed so many times it has memorized the motion. She held it for a moment before she placed it on the table between them. Alessandro looked at it, then at her. 12 years, she said quietly. I carried it every day. He opened it. The first item was a letter. Handwritten, in a careful, unhurried script. The handwriting of a woman who knew she might not have many more opportunities to write anything and wanted this to be legible. Sophia had written it the night before the switch. 2 pages, front and back. She named Dante Ricci in the second sentence and did not equivocate. She detailed the conversation she had overheard, the corridor, the time, the precise language used. She described the payment, a transfer of funds routed through a property account in Palermo that Dante controlled independently of Moretti oversight. She described the motive with the plainness of a woman who had no reason left to be diplomatic about it. Alessandro read every word. He set the letter down and reached into the envelope again. Photographs. 6 of them, printed on the kind of paper that suggested they had been taken with a decent camera by someone who understood the importance of clarity. Dante in a restaurant Alessandro didn't recognize. Across a table from 2 men he did. Gallo family, a rival organization that had been negotiating the edges of Moretti territory for years with the patience of people waiting for an opening. In the clearest photograph, Dante's hand was extended across the table. The man opposite him was holding a document. At the bottom corner of the document, visible enough to confirm and small enough to suggest it wasn't meant to be seen, was the Moretti family seal. Alessandro set the photographs beside the letter. He did not arrange them. He simply placed them down with the deliberate calm of a man building a case inside his own mind. There was one more item in the envelope. A small digital recorder. The kind that had been unremarkable technology 12 years ago, and now looked like an artifact from another era. Isabella picked it up herself. Her hands were steady. "Sofia mailed this to me the morning of the accident," she said. She knew there was a chance the plan would go wrong. She knew she might not make it out. So she recorded herself first. She pressed play. Sofia's voice filled the room. It was quieter than Alessandro expected, unhurried. The voice of a woman who had made peace with something and was simply ensuring that her making peace with it would mean something. She stated her name. She stated the date. She described everything, the conversation, the corridor, the names, in the same precise language as the letter, with the addition of details that only a person present could have known. Specific phrases Dante had used. The time the conversation had ended. The sound of his footsteps going back toward his own wing of the house. She ended with a single sentence that had nothing to do with evidence. "I hope the children have his eyes," she said. "It would be a shame to waste them." The recording ended. The room held the silence that follows a voice that no longer has a living body attached to it. Alessandro stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the gate, still lit by the floodlights, rain still falling across the gravel in the dark. He stood with his hands at his sides, perfectly, completely still. The stillness that the men who served him had learned over 16 years to recognize not as peace, not as restraint, but as the moment after a decision has already been made and is simply waiting for the world to catch up to it. He stood at that window for a long time. Then he said 4 words. "Where is he now?" Dante was summoned at midnight. The message was routine. "Alessandro needs you, sitting room now." The kind of message Dante had received hundreds of times across 16 years, at all hours, for all manner of things. He arrived the way he always arrived, unhurried, buttoning his jacket in the corridor, already composing his face into the particular expression of quiet readiness that had defined his entire tenure inside this house. He opened the door and walked in, and stopped. What happened to his face in that moment was not something he chose. It was involuntary, a flicker that crossed his features in the space of a single second and was gone almost before it fully formed. Recognition. Then something colder and faster that he pulled back behind his eyes with the practiced speed of a man who had spent 16 years managing his own reactions inside a house, full of people trained to read them. But Alessandro had seen it. He said nothing. He gestured toward the chair across the table with the same economy of movement he used for everything. Dante sat, and Alessandro, without a word, placed Sofia's letter on the table, then the photographs. Then he pressed play on the recorder. Dante listened to Sofia's voice fill the room with his hands flat on his thighs and his face composed into an expression of careful neutrality that cost him visible effort to maintain. When the recording ended, He sat with the silence for a moment. Then he said, "I did what needed to be done." His voice was steady, almost gentle, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this conversation in his own mind for 12 years and had decided, somewhere along the way, that the version in which he was right was the one he would inhabit. "She was a vulnerability," he said. "The pregnancy made you exposed in ways you couldn't see because you were too close to it. 3 rival families were already moving. I had the intelligence. I had the timeline. A child changes everything. It makes a man hesitate. It gives enemies a target with no protection and no training. I removed the threat before it removed you." He paused. "Everything I built for this empire over 16 years, I built it to protect you. Every decision I made for this family." Alessandro let him finish. Then he said very quietly, "My sons grew up without a father for 16 years. He let that land. You made that decision. For the empire." Something shifted in Dante's composure. Not collapse, but a fracture. Barely visible. Enough. Alessandro stood. He looked toward the door and said one word. The door opened. Luca and Marco walked in together, side by side, the way they had stood at the gate, straight-spined and still. They stopped near the center of the room and looked at Dante with the gray eyes they had inherited from a father they were only now beginning to know. They said nothing. They didn't need to. Dante looked at them, at the living proof of what his decision had tried to erase. And for the first time in the entire encounter, his face did something that required no interpretation. He looked away first. Alessandro reached across the table. He picked up Sophia's letter, folded it once along its original crease, with the care a person gives to something that has earned careful handling, and placed it in his breast pocket, close to where it needed to be kept. Then he nodded once to the men standing at the door. They came forward. Dante stood without being told to. One final act of the composure that had served him for 16 years and would not serve him any further. He allowed himself to be guided toward the door, without resistance. He did not look at the twins again. The door closed behind him. The room held the 3 Morettis, Alessandro, Luca, and Marco, in a silence that was nothing like the silence that had lived in this house for 12 years. That silence had been absence. This one was something else entirely. Alessandro looked at his sons. Marco looked back at him and said, with the directness of a boy who had clearly inherited something beyond just the eyes, "Is it over?" Alessandro placed his hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. "Yes," he said. He went alone the next morning. The same black car, the same eastern road through the estate, the same private cemetery at the edge of the Moretti grounds, tucked behind a stand of cypress trees that made it invisible from the main house. He had made this drive every year for 12 years, and his hands on the wheel had always felt the same. Purposeful, controlled, carrying the specific weight of a man moving toward something painful, because moving toward it was the only form of respect he had left to offer. This morning, his hands felt different. He carried white roses. 7. Always 7. But he stood at the iron gate of the cemetery for a moment longer than usual before he pushed it open, because the walk from the gate to the headstone was a walk he had made as one kind of man for 12 years, and he understood that this morning he would make it as another. He stopped in front of the stone. Isabella Moretti, beloved wife and mother. He read the inscription the way he always read it. Then he lowered himself to one knee in the wet grass, the way he never had before, and he stayed there. "Your name is Sophia," he said quietly. "I don't know your family name yet. I will find it. I'll find everything. Where you came from, who you belonged to, whether there is anyone left who loved you, and never understood what happened to you. The cypress trees moved in the morning wind. You were a servant in my house, he continued. You had no power here, no protection, no reason to do what you did beyond the fact that you decided to do it. He paused. I don't have a word for what that is. I've spent my entire life in a world that runs on obligation and consequence and leverage. What you did doesn't fit inside any of that. He placed the 7 white roses at the base of the headstone. I'm going to have this stone remade, he said. Your name on it. Your real name, in full, the way it deserves to be written. And I am going to make sure that the 2 boys whose lives you purchased with yours know exactly who you were and exactly what you gave them. He stayed a moment longer, long enough to let the morning settle around him, long enough to feel the particular quality of a grief that had been transformed without being erased. 12 years of mourning had not been wasted. They had simply been attributed incorrectly. The loss was real. The love had been real. Only the name on the stone had been wrong. He stood, turned, and walked back through the iron gate toward the manor where Isabella and his sons were waiting, for the first time in 12 years, for him to come home. The kitchen was the last place Alessandro Moretti was ever expected to be found. It was a large room at the back of the manor, stone floors, high windows, the kind of space that functioned without him, because everything in this house had learned to function without him. But Isabella had always preferred it to the formal rooms, and so when he came back from the cemetery and followed the sound of quiet voices through the corridor, it was the kitchen he found her in. She was sitting at the table with 2 cups of coffee that had already gone cold. She had not drunk hers. She was simply sitting with it the way people sit, with something they needed to do with their hands. Alessandro pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who have said the most important things and are now finding the shape of what comes after. I never replaced you, he said, not as a declaration, just as a fact he needed her to have. Isabella looked at him across the cold coffee. I know, she said. I watched. From a distance, I always had someone watching, not the Empire, you. I needed to know you were still standing. Were you ever going to come back? She considered the question, with the honesty it deserved. When it was safe, she said, and when they were old enough that you couldn't look at them and have any doubt. A sound in the doorway interrupted them. Luca stood at the entrance to the kitchen, with the careful posture of a boy, cataloging a room he wasn't sure yet he was allowed to belong to. He looked at his father with the gray eyes that had been taking inventory of Alessandro since the gate, measuring, reserving judgment, unwilling to give anything away before he understood what it was worth. Behind him, Marco pushed past with no such reservation. Are those your cars in the garage? He said, looking directly at Alessandro. The ones under the covers. There are 7 of them. Alessandro looked at his son, at this boy who had never once met him and was already treating him like a resource to be assessed. And something happened in his chest that rose before he could stop it. He laughed, not a polite sound, not the controlled exhale that passed for amusement in the world he moved through. A real laugh, unguarded, unplanned, arriving from somewhere that had been sealed off for so long that it surprised even him. The narration notes, quietly, that it was the first time in 12 years. Isabella watched it happen with an expression she didn't try to manage. Luca watched it too, and something in his face shifted fractionally. Not a smile. Not yet. But the beginning of a recalculation. Alessandro looked across the table at Isabella, then at his sons, then back at Isabella. There is a lot of road ahead, he said. Yes, she agreed. 12 years is not a morning. No, she said, it isn't. They sat with that truth between them, not flinching from it, not papering over it with sentiment it hadn't earned. Trust was not a thing that returned because a story resolved. It was a thing rebuilt in the specific currency of ordinary days. 1,000 small moments, compounding slowly into something that could hold weight again. But the door was open, and Alessandro Moretti, sitting in his own kitchen in the morning light with cold coffee and 2 sons and the woman he had grieved for 12 years, was, for the first time since a rainy night and a mahogany coffin and an iron gate, not a ghost. He was a man again. And the house, somehow, felt it. Let's sit with this story for a moment, because what just happened in that manner is not simply a tale about a husband and a wife and a secret that survived 12 years. It is a story about where betrayal actually lives. And the answer is never where we expect it. We spend our lives watching the gates, building the walls higher, vetting the strangers, calculating the enemies positioned across the table from us. We do all of this with discipline and vigilance and the hard-won intelligence of people who have been hurt before and have decided quietly that it will not happen again. And then the person in the chair closest to ours, the one who stood at our lowest moment and wept beside us, the one who read our silence better than anyone, the one we let in precisely because we had let no one else in, turns out to have been the architect of the thing we were grieving. That is what Dante was. Not an enemy Alessandro failed to identify. A trusted man who made himself indispensable in the wreckage of his own creation, who built 16 years of loyalty on top of a betrayal so deep that the loyalty itself became the cover, and who might have kept it forever if a woman had not walked back through the iron gates in the rain with 2 boys and gray eyes and an envelope that had survived 12 years of hiding because she refused to let Sofia be forgotten. And that is the part of this story that should stay with you longest. Not Alessandro, not the empire, not even Isabella. Sofia. A servant with no power, no legacy, no leverage, and no obligation. A woman who overheard something she wasn't meant to hear and made a decision that cost her everything. Not for reward, not for recognition, not because anyone would ever know. She died with a false name in a burning car on a coastal road, and the world buried her under someone else's headstone and moved on. History would have forgotten her completely, except Isabella didn't. Isabella carried her name for 12 years in a weathered envelope next to her heart, in a village at the edge of the sea, raising 2 boys who will now grow up knowing exactly who made their lives possible. Some people leave monuments. Some people leave empires. Sofia left 2 boys with gray eyes and a father who finally came home. That is not a small thing. Now here is the question I want you to sit with, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments, because I think this one will divide you. 12 years, 2 sons, 1 grave with the wrong name on it. If you were Alessandro, could you ever truly forgive? Not perform forgiveness, not choose to move forward because the evidence was overwhelming, and the love was real, and the door was finally open. But forgive, the way forgiveness is supposed to work, the kind that doesn't leave a residue, the kind that doesn't surface at 3 a.m. in the silence of a house that spent 12 years learning to live without her. Or would the 12 years always sit between you? Not as anger, not even as blame, just as time, irretrievable, unshared. 12 years of his sons growing up without his voice in the room, and the knowledge that she made that choice, however impossible the alternative, however right she was to make it. Could you hold all of that and still choose her? Tell me in the comments, because some stories don't end with answers. They end with the right questions.